With version 2.0 right around the corner, we're going to be getting an event where upon completion, we can select a free 4-star character. Those characters being Yukong, Sampo, Guifen, and Asta. Now each of these characters have their own pros and cons. Some are easier to use in teams more than others. Others are more specialized. I'm going to go over these characters briefly to give you an idea of who is best suited for your account. Starting off with Yukong, I do think she is going to be the hardest character to sell for this event, as she is very reliant on speed tuning due to the nature of her kit. The gist of her kit is that after the use of her skill, all allies will get an attack boost, and then when every ally turn ends, she will lose a stack of her roaring bowstrings. So that means after Yukong uses her skill, you do have to have your DPS go after Yukong to make use of that attack boost, and they have to go twice in a row, otherwise that second attack boost is going to go to a unit other than your DPS. And similar with her ultimate, she also gives a crit and crit damage boost if she has that roaring bowstrings active, and if it's not active, it's just a flat damage boost. Now the only way I could really recommend Yukong for this event is if you have her at E5, as when you have her at E5, you can then get her E6, which allows her to gain a roaring bowstring stack when she uses her ultimate. This allows Yukong to use her ultimate right before a DPS to get that attack boost. So you do have to worry a little less about your speed tuning. It is not as strict and it makes her a little more versatile. But it is still incredibly difficult to use her kit effectively without a lot of turn manipulation and speed tuning. Moving on to Sampo. Sampo is in a pretty difficult spot right now with Black Swan leading the banner for 2.0. Many people are going to replace Sampo on their Kafka teams with Black Swan. However, I do think Sampo still has a place on Kafka and Black Swan compositions, or even Black Swan with Sampo. He still brings quite a bit to the table, and I wouldn't really write him off just with the arrival of Black Swan. Now, Sampo's main role is a sub DPS debuffer. With his skill, it is a bounce attack that hits enemies at random and hits them with wind shear, but his ultimate also hits enemies with a dot vulnerability debuff, so enemies take additional damage from dots for 2 turns. So you can see how well he fits in Kafka comps, as he overall increases her damage output. So moving on to his Eidolons, he does have a few more important Eidolons to aim for. We're going to start off with his E1. His E1 is pretty okay. It does give him an additional bounce off of his skill, so that's just more opportunity to spread wind shear. And if you're going single target, if you're dealing with a single target, that's additional toughness shred on wind weak enemies, so it'll really add up over time. His second Eidolon is probably his least useful Eidolon, as it does require enemies to be defeated by wind shear, and when they are defeated by wind shear, it does spread wind shear to the rest of the enemies. In most situations, you're not going to find enemies dying to wind shear. It's very unlikely that you'll actually see any use out of this Eidolon. The biggest game changers for Sampo that kind of elevate him from a sub DPS to a main DPS is his E4 and E6. Starting with his E4, when enemies have 5 or more stacks of wind shear, they immediately take 8% of the current wind shear damage. So Sampo has his own wind shear detonation built into his kit starting at E4. And then his E6 increases his wind shear damage multiplier by 15%. So obviously, as of right now, his best partner is Kafka, as she can detonate all of his wind shear stacks, and then Sampo can even detonate his own wind shear stacks. As I have my Sampo fully built and I do plan on using him with Kafka and Black Swan, I'll probably go for the E6 for that additional damage boost from him. And I do think I'll make a separate video on Sampo's viability, because I do think he still has a place even with Black Swan's arrival. All right, moving on to Guifen. She is in a similar role to Sampo. She is a sub DPS debuffer centered around burns. So her entire kit, it revolves around burning the enemies and then hitting them with a fire kiss debuff. Every time an enemy takes burn damage, either through their turn starting or Kafka detonating, they will get this Fire Kiss debuff, which then makes them take a certain amount of more damage for 3 turns, and this does stack up to 3 times. So Guifen does enable more damage for your team through her debuffs. Moving on to her Eidolons, Guifen has several Eidolons that greatly enhance her kit. Her E1 is probably her least important, as it only reduces the enemy's effect res by 10% when she uses her skill. Her E2 is good to get, as it does increase the burn damage inflicted by her basic attack or skill by 40%. That is just overall burn increase, and I do believe this will also trigger from Kafka's detonation as well. So if you have an E2 Guifen, it greatly benefits Kafka. Her E4 allows Guifen to get a decent amount of energy regeneration, as every burn tick on an enemy will give her 2 regenerated energy. So when you have a full group of enemies inflicted by burn and you have Kafka ult, for example, that's going to be upwards to like 10 plus energy for Guifen. So that will also be pretty good to have. Her best Eidolon is hands down her E6, as it gives her 1 more Fire Kiss stack count from 3 to 4. So that is just an additional damage boost to your entire squad, 2 enemies inflicted by Fire Kiss. So for Guinefen's priority, I would have her E6 followed by E2, E4, E1. So if you're sitting on E1, E3, or E5, Guifen is going to be a decent pick, as her 2, 4, and 6 Eidolons are pretty good for her kits. And then lastly, we're going to go over Asta, who is, I'm going to say, hands down the best pick for just about anybody for this event, as all of her Eidolons are useful. Her kit is incredibly versatile. You can slot her in any composition and be just fine. Her kit is very straightforward. Her ultimate gives a flat 40 speed boost for 2 turns. That is actually huge. And then her skill gives the entire team an attack boost based off of the number of charges she gets, and she gets these charges through her skill attacking fire weak enemies. So moving on to her Eidolons, if you do not have her at E6, I would 100% recommend getting Asta, as every Eidolon benefits her, and as a harmony unit, she is good on just about any team. Looking at her E1, whenever she uses a skill, she deals 1 extra damage to a random enemy. It is similar to Sampo, she gains an additional bounce to her skill and eliminates some of the RNG behind gaining her charge stacks in the event that not every enemy has fire weakness. Her E2 allows her to save some skill points, as after using her ultimate, she won't have her charge stacks reduced in her next turn. So it gives you an additional turn of that max attack boost before you have to skill with Asta again to regain those charge stacks. Her E4 is essentially a permanent 15% energy regeneration rate, as long as she has 2 or more charging stacks. There's very few situations where Asta will find herself dipping below 2 charging stacks. And then her E6 makes it so that her charging stacks lost each turn is reduced by 1. So instead of losing 3 stacks every turn, she only loses 2. So at the very least, she will start her turn with 3 stacks, which means she will still gain the benefit of her E4 Eidolon, and it does also reduce the number of enemies you need to hit to regain up to those 5 stacks. So if I were to give these characters a priority ranking on who you should pick, I would put Asta at the very first position, regardless of the Eidolon you have. I would only pick any of the other 3 characters if you already have Asta at E6. If you do not have Asta at E6, I would pick Asta. She is the most beneficial character of the 3. Sampo and Guifen, I'm going to put them on equal ground with condition. Sampo only if you intend on using him with Kafka and or Black Swan. If you're not going to use him with either, then I would not select him. even though he is a solid win DPS in his own right. And then similarly with Guifen, I would pick her even Eidolons 2, 4, and 6. And then again, only if you already have her slotted into a team composition. And lastly, I would only recommend Yukong if you're going to get her to E6 with this event. Let me know down below whether you agree or disagree with my reasonings behind the character selections. And who are you going to pick for the free 4-star for the event? Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. And I want to thank you all for watching.